Hello, and welcome to the long-awaited follow-up to my first etymology video, this time revealing the hidden meanings behind the location, item and character names in Shadow of the Erdtree. I'll be looking not just at where the names come from linguistically, but at the references being made and how they tie into the lore more generally, and believe me, there's a lot of very revealing information here. One thing you'll notice as we go along is the sheer breadth of historical and language sources being drawn on, and that's a very deliberate choice by FromSoft. Lorically cluttered world building is how they create a more immersive experience. It makes the world feel real and multifaceted in ways we'll never fully understand. One last quick thing to mention before we get started is that the English names sometimes only make sense if we look at the Japanese spelling first to account for extra syllables, especially U's. Sometimes these get transliterated into the English names, sometimes not, but I'll point these out as we go along. I was pleased to see that Ymir has finally made an appearance as I anticipated in previous videos. Those who watched my first etymology and world building videos will remember we discussed Ymir, a progenitor figure from Norse mythology whose body parts were said to make up the physical world. I only originally discussed Ymir at all because that is the alternative name of Aurgelmir, from whom I suggested Mount Gelmir got its name. Ymir and the subject of body parts leads me neatly onto Metyr, Mother of Fingers. Metyr is, as far as can be ascertained, the oldest form of the word from which most other words for mother are derived, including the ancient Greek and Latin. That is important for two reasons. The first and most obvious is that it cements her identity as the mother of fingers. The other, more subtle reason is that using such an ancient word implicitly codes Metyr as belonging to the earliest knowable era of the in-game world. As we see from her remembrance, she is a daughter of the Greater Will and was the first shooting star to land. Now, having long since been abandoned, she is, in many ways, ancient history. The names of the finger ruin seem to be a few extra finger-themed references packed in. Spelling aside, Dheo is Latin for God, so this may be inspired by the famous finger of God in Michelangelo's Birth of Adam. Rhea may be a slightly more oblique reference to the Greek goddess of the same name, who was served by the fingers, or dactyls in Greek, 10 mythical smiths who imparted knowledge of the alphabet to mankind. I wonder if this is the inspiration behind the smith script items. Sometimes they are recorded as being 10 in number, sometimes 3. That, of course, would have heavy lore implications if it is correct. Finally, Miyr seems to come from the word for finger in various Celtic languages. Rellana is introduced to us as Renala's younger sister. Rellana is obviously not a name with meaning in its own right, but an inverted form of her sister's name. Let me quickly remind you that Rennala, rather like Renata or Renee, means rebirth, which of course accords with her role in the game. I'll also mention, just because it's my favourite little theory, that her name may also be a pun, because the first part, renal, is a word in its own right which means relating to kidneys, and the embryonic larval tears which initiate rebirth are conspicuously kidney-shaped. Rellana's knight Moonrithyll is a callback to Dark Souls 3 and Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. The name Irithyll is a Tolkien reference derived from the Sindarin Elvish for moon. The two castles in the early section of the game both have Latin names which suggest their involvement in war. Ensis simply means sword and was mostly used in a poetic sense. It is associated with long swords as opposed to the shorter gladius used by Roman foot soldiers. Belurat comes from the verb bello, which means to wage war. This one is a bit tricky since Belurat is not a valid conjugation, but rather a transliteration from the Japanese spelling with the extra U left in. The Japanese syllabary, as some of you may know, doesn't allow for strings of consonants. A more conventional transliteration gives you the intended form bellato. That is a third-person future imperative form and means we will go to war. We discussed in previous videos the heavy religious imagery which I believe inspires Miquella and Messmer. I won't repeat that entire discussion here, but given that Miquella is, if I'm correct, inspired by St. Michael, I checked to see if there were any links between Trina and St. Catherine, which is the full version of that name. Very pleasingly, it turns out, St. Catherine of Siena, an important saint and mystic, is strongly associated in her iconography with lilies. I already spoke about the symbolism of lilies in the St. Trina video, but this is yet another connection which potentially explains why they chose that name. Messmer's name also has links to St. Trina and the theme of sleep, which, to me, confirms that they were designed and planned partly with each other in mind. Messmer is a name from Middle German meaning knife maker, although I think he is named after a specific individual, namely Franz Messmer. Franz Messmer was a physician whose experiments with magnetic forces formed a precursor to the field of hypnosis. It is from him that the word mesmerized comes. The Euporia twin blade, inspired by Miquella and Melania, takes its name from the ancient Greek word for abundance. No surprise here, since we've known about this weapon for some time already. Thiollier is a curious one, conspicuously French in a way that made me certain it must have been a reference to a particular individual, but of the few people who do bear that name, none seem in any way to be connected to poison or plants or anything similar. I found the answer only once I checked the Kana spelling and discovered that Thiollier is a creative localization of the much more common name Thierry. It is inspired by one of the titular characters in the 1621 play Thierry and Théodore, a Jacobean revenge tragedy in which Thierry, brother of the king, is poisoned by his evil mother Brunhilde. At the end, as he lies dying, unable to rest, Brunhilde is apprehended and subject to sleep deprivation as punishment. Then he dies and his fiancée Ordella comes to his deathbed and dies of a broken heart. Charo's hidden grave is a reference to Charon, the ferryman of Greek mythology who delivered souls over the river Styx to the underworld. That's why this area, all the way down to the fissure, features these large stone coffins in the form of ships. The bull-shaped figureheads are an interesting feature. In terms of Greek mythology, the only link between bulls and water is that Zeus, in the form of a bull, abducted Europa and swam her to Crete. Cheaper than flying, I suppose. More broadly, even though water is a pretty universal symbol of life, in Elden Ring it seems to be associated with death. Godwyn's corpse has mutated with a fish tail, the undead are summoned by mariners, and spirits seem to be able to take the form of jellyfish, or now eels. Rauh is one of the more obscure and yet most enlightening references used so far, and is a concept from ancient Hindu cosmology. The Japanese uses the same spelling for both, but the English localization drops the final U. Rauh is the precessional orbit of the moon, which, where it intersects the path of the sun, causes eclipses. Despite not being a physical object, it is traditionally allocated the role of a so-called shadow planet, owing to its astrological influence. It is ascribed the role of an evil body, an enemy of the sun and moon, and associated with confusion, materialism, and fear. The lore parallels are pretty clear. Obviously, this is a very early precedent for the concept of a shadow world, and was likely considered a noteworthy reference for that reason alone. Romina, her temple and the sealing tree all take their inspiration from the Roman goddess Romina, who was invoked for breastfeeding mothers, both human and animal. Her temple stood next to the sacred fig tree under which Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome, were nursed by a she-wolf. Anytime the tree withered, it was taken as a bad omen for the city, and it was desperately revived or replanted. If we really stretch, we could say it's appropriate that it was a fig tree, because fig leaves have the connotations of covering up, just as the sealing tree covers up or obscures Enir-Ilim. Enir-Ilim is an interesting and unexpected turn into Akkadian, that is, the language of ancient Mesopotamia, written in cuneiform, and one of the oldest languages known to have existed. In the Mesopotamian religion, at certain times at least, the chief deity was the sky god An, whose spouse was the earth goddess Antu. The Enir, which comes from the word for weariness, was her ritual bedchamber in the temple complex. Ilim means of God, and so this legacy dungeon has a name which means bedchamber of God. I will talk about this more in a dedicated video, but the implications of the name tie into the lore of the Gate of Divinity and the fact that a consort is required. This so-called bedchamber temple is where lordship is ritually, if not sexually, consummated into godhood. Incidentally, Akkadian is a Semitic language, which is why the name Enir-Ilim may strike you as having a ring of Hebrew or Arabic about it. It suggests something ancient and mysteriously holy. Another Akkadian reference is to be found in one of the more unexpected places, namely Midra's manse. Nanaya, depicted here in the portrait, takes her name from the Mesopotamian goddess of love. Midra or Mithra are valid spellings of Mithras, a deity from the Old Persian Zoroastrian religion and an all-seeing god of light. The root of his name, which means binding, also makes him the god of oaths. The lore of the frenzied flame is heavily inspired by Zoroastrianism, which views fire as having ritual purifying qualities and where fire temples are the chief sites of worship. If enough people in the comments are interested, this is something I might unpack more in a separate video. Jori the Inquisitor takes his name from one of the many hundreds of versions of the name George that exist in all languages. This is a reference to Saint George, who defeated the dragon with his lance. This is reflected in the way the Inquisition lanced Midra, the aspiring lord of frenzied flame, with their spear of torturous barbs. Let's finish off with the SCADUTREE, which is of course the central and defining feature of the Shadow Realms, just like the Erdtree in the lands between. As I mentioned, these names both come from Proto-Germanic, with Erd meaning earth, and Scadu meaning shadow. You can see how the gradual softening of the K gives rise to words like shadow and other related words like shade. So there you have my rundown of not every single name in Shadow of the Erdtree, but what I consider to be the most interesting and enlightening ones. I've presented these on the basis that I consider them to be convincing explanations, but if you have any other ideas or spot something that I may have missed, please share your theories in the comments. If you enjoyed this video but haven't seen my etymology video for the base game, I can recommend watching that for plenty more lore discoveries. Stay tuned for more lore, mythology and game design, and as ever, thank you for watching.